The sun was a white hammer, and the Sanavara basin was the anvil. It was high noon, a time when smart creatures burrowed and hid, when the shadows shrank to nothing, and the air itself seemed to crackle with heat. Elowen Vale was not a creature of this land, and she had nowhere left to hide. She was crawling. The verb was generous. It implied purpose, a forward motion. What she did was more of a horizontal shudder, a desperate dragging of a body that had given up hours ago. Her knees and elbows were raw, scraped open on the alkali crust and sharp pebbles. Her lips were split, two painful seams that tasted of salt and old blood. Thirst was not a sensation anymore. It was her entire reality. It was a spike driven through her tongue, a fire in her throat, a hollow ache that had consumed all other thoughts save one. Beneath her torn bodice, digging into the tender skin of her sternum, was a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. It was a miserable, unimportant-looking thing, but she guarded it with the last of her strength. Every lurch forward, she led with her shoulder, keeping the bag from grinding against the unforgiving earth. It was all that mattered. It was why she had to keep moving. The world had dissolved into a blinding white glare and the scrape of her own body. She no longer looked up. The horizon was a lie, a promise of more emptiness, and she had no currency left to buy hope. Miles away, sitting atop a bored-looking buckskin, Sutton Rooks saw her. He had not intended to be out. He was a man who preferred the deep shadows of his hollow, the company of his mules, and the steady rhythm of his water wheel. But a downed fence line had drawn him out, and now his eyes, narrowed against the glare, followed the unnatural movement on the basin floor. It was not a coyote, not a deer. It was too low, too desperate. It looked, he thought, like a single, scorched leaf tumbling in a wind that had died. He spat, the moisture vanishing before it hit the ground. A trap. That was his first thought. Apaches, maybe, or road agents, using a woman as bait. It was an old trick. He was an old hand. He should have turned his horse, Arrow, and ridden back into the cypress trees that marked his land. He did not. He nudged the buckskin forward, not directly at the shape, but in a long, cautious arc. His hand never left the worn stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He scanned the ridges, the heat-shimmering rocks, the dark mouths of arroyos. He was a man who lived by seeing things first. His gaze was a physical thing, sweeping the land for a glint of metal, a puff of dust, the silhouette of a man where no man should be. He saw nothing, only the woman, writhing. He reined Arrow to a halt a good 20 yards away and slid from the saddle. The movement was fluid, economical. He was not a large man, but he moved with a density that suggested he was rooted to the ground. He unhooked his canteen, the metal warm from the sun, the water inside precious. He walked toward her, his boots making no sound in the soft sand. He stopped 10 feet away. She had not noticed him. Her head was down, her breath a dry, rasping file. "Take this." His voice was like rocks grinding, rusty from disuse. Elowen's head snapped up. The motion sent a bolt of agony through her dehydrated frame. A man, a shadow blotting out the sun. Fear, primal and cold, shot through her, giving her a jolt of adrenaline. She tried to scramble backward, a pathetic crab-like motion that cost her everything. Sutton Rook did not move. He uncorked the canteen and tossed it. It landed with a soft thud in the sand just in front of her. "Go slow," he said. His gaze was not on her, but past her, sweeping the long, empty line of the horizon. He was still looking for the trap. Elowen stared at the canteen. It was real. She lunged for it, her raw hands fumbling with the cap. The water was hot, tinny, and more delicious than anything she had ever known. She choked, coughed, and forced herself to obey. Slow, small sips. The water hit her stomach like a punch, and for a terrifying second, she thought she would lose it. She held it down, her entire body shaking with the effort. It was then that Sutton Rook's gaze sharpened. He had seen it, miles to the east, but closing, a faint, reddish smear against the pale blue sky. Dust, 2 riders. They were moving fast, not meandering like cattle drovers. They were hunting. He made his decision. It was a poor one, and he knew it. It broke all his rules, but the sight of the woman, shuddering as she drank, had reminded him of something, a rabbit in a snare. He strode to her in 2 long steps. Elowen flinched, her hand flying to the bundle at her chest. "They are coming," he said. It was not a question. It was a judgment. He did not offer a hand. He bent, slipped one arm under her back, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her. She weighed nothing. A bundle of sticks and dry cloth. The smell of sun-baked fear came off her in waves. He turned back to his horse. Arrow sidestepped, his ears flicking at the strange, new burden. Sutton ignored it. He unslung his heavy canvas duster from the saddle roll. It was stiff with dust and smelled of horse sweat and faint, old tobacco. He threw it over her, covering her completely. "Hold on," he commanded, and settled her in the saddle. He grabbed the canteen, slung it, and swung up behind her in one smooth motion, his body fitting against her back. He gathered the reins, his scarred right hand brushing the duster. He did not go back the way he had come. He turned Arrow west, toward the jagged, unforgiving line of the Larkspur Rim. It was a goat's path, a hard, winding track of shale and switchbacks that no one used if they had a choice. It was, however, the one place he could not be easily followed. The 2 riders were closer now. Sutton could make them out. They wore dusters, but they sat their saddles with the arrogant slump of men who carried badges, or men who thought badges made them right. One had a rifle slung across his back. They were heading for the spot where he had found her. They were following her tracks. Sheriff Hollis Cray's men. He did not need to see the tin stars to know it. They were the only predators who hunted this far into the basin for anything other than cattle. He wondered, briefly, what a creature like this woman had done to earn their attention. He pushed Arrow into a steady, ground-eating trot. The motion was jarring. Beneath the duster, Elowen moaned. The sound was thin, like a kitten's. "Don't," she whispered. The word was a puff of hot air against the canvas. "Don't let them." She was delirious, but then her hand, a fragile, claw-like thing, emerged from under the coat. She was not reaching for him. She was clutching the fabric over her chest, holding the bundle in place. "Please," she breathed, her voice cracking. "They cannot see this." Sutton Rook said nothing. He did not ask what this was. He did not ask who they were. Questions were baggage, and he traveled light. He simply pressed his heels into Arrow's flanks. The horse, sensing the urgency, stretched into a careful run, its hooves striking sparks from the rising stones of the rim. They rode for an hour, the sun grilling them, the world a dizzying tilt of rock and sky. Elowen drifted in and out of a painful haze. She was aware of the heat of the man behind her, a solid, unyielding presence. She felt the rumble of his chest when he occasionally spoke a low word to the horse. She smelled the dust, the horse, and a faint, clean scent of juniper. They left the basin far below. The 2 riders were specks, circling the empty spot where she had been. They had lost the trail, for now, or at last. Sutton slowed the horse. They were in a thick stand of cypress, so old their branches intertwined, creating a canopy that cast the trail in deep, cool shadow. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Elowen shivered. The sudden cold a new kind of shock. Ahead, she heard a sound, a steady, rhythmic creak and splash, the sound of life. Sutton guided Arrow through a final, narrow gap in the rocks, and they emerged into a small, hidden hollow. It was a pocket of green in a world of brown. A small, neat log cabin sat backed against a sheer rock face, almost invisible. A creek, diverted by a stone channel, turned a tall, narrow water wheel, which powered a small stamp mill. The air smelled of water, whetstone, and pine. He dismounted, and for a moment, he just stood by the horse, letting the silence of the place settle back around him. This was Rook's Hollow, his sanctuary, and he had just brought the world into it. He reached up. "We are here." He lifted her down. Her legs buckled instantly, and he caught her. his arm a steel band around her waist. She was lighter than his feed sacks. He half carried, half dragged her toward the cabin's shaded porch. Elowen fought to stay conscious. She had to tell him. She had to be sure. Her eyes, gritty and unfocused, fixed on his face. He was a man made of sun-scorched leather and hard angles. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they never seemed to land on her, always on the tree-line, the path, the sky. He settled her on a simple wooden bench by the door. She slumped against the log wall, her head swimming. He went inside, and she heard the clank of a pump handle, then the splash of water. He returned with a tin cup. The water was shockingly cold. He knelt before her, not in supplication, but in practicality, holding the cup to her cracked lips. Again, he said, slow. She drank, the cold water a blessed agony. Her vision started to clear, and as she looked down at the man helping her, her gaze fell on his right hand, the one steadying the cup. It was not his hand that held her, it was his wrist. Peeking from the cuff of his worn shirt was a scar. It was not the clean line of a knife or the puckered mark of a bullet. It was wide, pale, and horribly textured. It was the distinct, chafed signature of a rope that had been pulled tight, a rope that had been meant to end a life. Elowen's breath hitched. She looked from the scar to his face. This man, this silent, watchful recluse, had been to the edge. He knew the feel of a mob's breath. He knew what it was to be hunted, to be judged, and to be left for dead. In that instant, Elowen Vale knew she was safe, not from the men hunting her, but from the man who had saved her. He would not betray her. The relief was so profound, so absolute, that it broke the last, frayed thread of her endurance. Her hand, which had been clutching the bag at her chest, went limp. The tin cup slipped from her fingers, clattering on the porch boards. Her eyes rolled back, and she slid into the darkness, her last sight the pale, angry scar on Sutton Rook's wrist. Sutton caught the cup before it rolled away. He watched her faint, his expression unreadable. He had brought her to his home. He had let her see his face, his land. He had let her see the mark he kept hidden from the world. He stood, wiping the cup on his trousers. He looked back toward the path, his eyes tracing the line of the ridge. He was under no illusions. He had not saved her. He had merely bought her time, miles away. On the edge of the great, empty basin, a red-tailed hawk made a lazy circle in the sky. It had seen the riders. It had seen the hollow. It was a patient hunter, and it knew that all things that ran eventually had to stop. The hunt was not over. It had only just been delayed. She woke to the smell of mint and wood smoke. For a long moment, Elowen lay perfectly still, convinced she was dreaming. The surface beneath her was soft, a cot mattress stuffed with what felt like fresh pine needles, covered by a thick, clean wool blanket. The air was cool and still, a sharp contrast to the sun-scorched furnace that had tried to claim her. The only sound was a steady, rhythmic creak and splash, a comforting, mechanical heartbeat that she recognized as the water wheel she'd glimpsed before fainting. She opened her eyes. She was in a cabin, but it was not the rough, dirty bachelor's hovel she might have expected. This was a kitchen, and it was immaculate. The log walls were chinked tight. A cast-iron stove in the corner was cold, but a small, simmering pot sat on a trivet near the back. A tin coffee pot beside it puffing a gentle steam that carried the scent of wild mint tea. The floor, made of wide pine planks, was swept clean. A single, long workbench ran under a window, holding tools that were not for cooking but for repair gears, leather straps and tins of grease, all arranged in precise, ordered rows. Her gaze fell on the wall next to the dry sink. 4 tin cups hung from 4 simple wooden pegs. The details snagged in her mind. 4 cups, not 1, not 2, 4. This house, this sanctuary of solitude, had been built for more than one person. It was a room that held the ghost of a family, a life that had once been fuller. She pushed herself up, a groan of pain escaping her. Her body was a map of new aches, but the searing, agonizing thirst was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, hollow hunger. Her own clothes, the torn and filthy dress, were gone, in their place. She wore a man's long undershirt, the cotton soft from 100 washings, and it fell to her knees. Her dress, she saw, was washed and hanging neatly over the back of a chair near the stove, drying. The oilcloth bundle, her burden, sat on the small kitchen table, untouched. The cabin door opened, and she flinched, pulling the blanket tighter. Sutton Rook entered. He moved without a sound, his boots seeming to understand the floorboards. He carried 3 fresh eggs in one hand and a small pail. He did not look at her. He went to the sink, washed his hands, and then moved to the stove, where he cracked the eggs into a small skillet with a piece of salt pork. He was a man of economical motion. He wasted nothing, no extra steps, no flourishes. He was as spare and functional as the room he inhabited. He did not speak. He plated the eggs, added a thick slice of dark bread, and brought the tin plate to the table. He gestured to the bench. Elowen swung her legs over the side of the cot, the cotton shirt whispering against her raw knees. She sat at the table, her hands shaking slightly. Sutton placed a bowl in front of her. It was a thick, hot soup made of jerky and dried corn, but it smelled like a feast. He poured her a cup of the mint tea. "Eat," he said. The word was not a request. She ate. She ate with the desperation of a starving animal, then forced herself to slow down, mimicking his own controlled nature. He sat opposite her, not eating, just watching his own hands as they rested on the table. His eyes, she noted, were always in motion, but they never landed on her face. They scanned the window, the door, the ceiling, as if he were constantly checking the integrity of his trap, ensuring the world was still locked out. When she had finished, the warmth of the food spreading through her limbs, she felt the first true stirring of her own will returning. She took a deep breath, the air still sweet with mint. "You saved my life," she said, her voice a dry rasp. He grunted, his gaze fixed on a crack in the ceiling plaster. "I saved you trouble. Life is still pending." She knew he was right. She looked at the oilcloth bundle. It was small, but it felt as heavy as a case of ammunition. He had respected it. He had not opened it, had not moved it far. He had brought it in and left it, a silent question between them. She owed him the answer. More than that, she needed to know if he was a man who would understand the answer. The scar on his wrist said he might. Her fingers, still clumsy, fumbled with the string. She unwrapped the oilcloth, her movement slow. The square of waterproof fabric fell away, revealing a simple, leather-bound book. It was a standard post-emporium ledger, the kind used for tracking freight and feed. Sutton's eyes flickered to it, then away. "It is a ledger," Elowen said, her voice gaining a fraction of its strength. "From the post-emporium in Mesa Fortuna." She opened it. The pages were filled with columns of neat, precise figures, her own handwriting. But interspersed with the regular entries of corn shipments and telegraph fees were other, stranger entries, coded. "My mother passed when I was 16, she said, the words coming out haltingly. She had not told this story. She had not had anyone to tell. She was a teacher. She taught me letters, but more importantly, she taught me numbers. She said numbers do not lie. Men lie. Weather lies, but numbers always tell the truth if you know how to listen." Sutton's hand, the one with the scarred wrist, moved. His fingers went to his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, dark object. A wooden pipe. The bowl was charred, but the stem was smooth. It was unlit. He did not fill it. He simply held it, his thumb stroking the smooth curve of the bowl, a habit so ingrained it had survived the absence of the tobacco. "I got a job with Mr. Abernathy at the Emporium, bookkeeping. I was good at it. I listened." She tapped the page. "And the numbers started telling a story I did not understand," she explained. How the Emporium was also the defector town bank, the telegraph office, and the land registry. How Judge Bartholomew Pike, a man everyone praised for his vision, kept his accounts there. How Silas Torn, the representative for the new railroad spur, also kept his accounts there. It was a mistake, she whispered, a ghost of the old fear in her voice. Mr. Abernathy was sick. He asked me to reconcile the books, both sets. Sutton's head moved, a sharp, bird-like tilt. 2 sets, one for the public, the one he showed the town council, the one that showed the railroad investments were just investments. She turned the page, her finger running down a column of figures that looked innocent. This is the other one, the judge's private book. She pointed. This is not a number for land, this is a date. And this, she indicated a payment listed as consulting fees to Silas Torn, is a water claim, number 42, my father's old claim, before he died, the one that waters the south pasture. Sutton was still, but his thumb had stopped moving on the pipe. They are not just buying land, Mr. Rook, they are stealing the water, all of it. Pike is using his bench to condemn claims based on false surveys, and Tornay is buying them for 10 cents on the dollar for the railroad, claiming it is for the good of the town. They are planning to divert the entire Fortuna Creek before the summer dry down. They are going to sell the water rights back to the town at a 200% markup. She finally looked up, her eyes pleading. He will bleed Mesa Fortuna dry. He will own the water, and the man who owns the water owns everything. You were discovered. Sutton stated. It was not a question. She nodded, her throat tight. I asked the wrong question. I asked Mr. Abernathy why a consulting fee was paid on the same day the Willow Flats claim went dry. He turned pale. He told me to go home, to forget I saw it. She shook her head, a tear finally tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. That night, I saw 2 of Sheriff Cray's deputies watching my house. Not guarding, watching. I knew what it meant. I took the ledger. I took my mother's money, what little there was, and I ran. She had been running for 3 days. The cabin was silent, save for the steady splash of the water wheel. Sutton Rook placed the unlit pipe on the table. He looked at the book, his pale eyes tracing the neat columns of her accusation. He understood numbers, too. He understood the math of water, land, and greed. Sable Junction, Elowen said, her voice hardening with the purpose that had driven her through the desert. There is a federal marshal there. He is not on Pike's payroll. He does not answer to the railroad. This book, she laid her hand on it, possessively. This book means nothing in Mesa Fortuna. It will get me hanged, but in Sable Junction, in a federal court, it is a confession. Sutton looked at her, his gaze finally, fully, resting on her face. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a bundle of rags, but as a different kind of survivor. Since, he said, and for a moment she did not understand. Sheriff Cray, he is not a lawman. He is a tool, and he will not stop. He cannot. This book proves he is a part of it. He nodded, as if confirming a fact he already knew. He will sweep this entire basin. He will check every ranch, every hollow. His eyes went to the window, and his face, which had been so unreadable, tightened. Outside, the wind, which had been blowing steadily from the south, gusted. It shifted, coming down from the high pass to the north. The change in direction hit the great wooden blades of the water wheel. The steady, rhythmic splash and creak faltered. For a second, there was a horrible, high-pitched shriek of wood grinding on its axle, a sound like a pained scream. It was a warning. The atmosphere of the sanctuary was broken. Sutton stood. He did not hurry, but his movements were now charged with a new energy. He crossed the room to a large, dark wood chest that sat beneath the window, its top covered in neatly coiled ropes and harnesses. He opened the lid. The smell of cedar and old leather wafted out. He pushed aside several tanned hides and pulled out a rolled canvas sheet. He spread it on the table, pushing aside the plates. It was not a printed map. It was old, drawn in charcoal and ink. The lines faded. It showed the mountains, the creeks, the basins. But it was covered in dozens of small, dotted lines, trails that Elowen had never seen on any map in the Emporium. The old trails, Sutton said. his finger tracing a path that seemed to go straight through a line of mountains. Miners' trails, Apache routes. The railroad does not know them. Cray does not know them. He looked up from the map, his pale blue eyes, which had avoided hers, now locked onto them. They were intense, devoid of pity, but filled with a sudden, fierce focus. "Can you walk?" he asked. It was the most important question of her life. She was battered, exhausted, her muscles screaming in protest. But she thought of the water. She thought of the numbers. She thought of the 4 tin cups on the wall, a silent testament to a life that could be taken away. She nodded, pulling her chin up. "Yes," as she said it. A movement outside the window caught her eye. It was far off, at the very edge of the cypress grove that guarded the entrance to the hollow. A shadow. A man on a horse. He was not moving. He was sitting perfectly still, a dark silhouette against the ridgeline, looking down into the hollow. He was too far away to see her, but he was there. Elowen's breath caught in her throat. The soup turned to ice in her stomach. Sutton, seeing her face change, did not even need to look. He already knew. "He found the trail," he said, his voice flat. He began to roll the map. "We will have to use the dark." Darkness came to the hollow not as a blanket, but as a tide, rising from the ground up. The cypress trees melted into the rock face, and the water wheels splashing became the only landmark, a sound in a void. Sutton had spent the last hour of twilight in near silence, his movements economical and swift. He had packed 2 saddlebags with dried meat, hardtack, a tin of his precious coffee, and a coil of thin, strong rope. He gave Elowen a pair of boy's trousers and a shirt, garments left over from the hollow's previous life, items he had not had the heart to discard. They were worn but clean, and far better for travel than her mended dress. He also gave her a pair of boots, too large, which she stuffed with rags. He rewrapped the ledger in its oilcloth, then wrapped it again in a piece of tanned deer hide, strapping it into a tight, neat bundle. He did not hand it to her. He secured it himself in the bottom of a saddlebag, under the food. He was not taking charge of it. He was making it part of their shared provisions. "That scout," Sutton said, his voice low as he cinched a strap. "He will not come in the dark. He knows this ground is mine. He will wait for Cray, and they will come at dawn, believing us trapped." He led his horse, Arrow, from the small lean-to. He also led a squat, stubborn-looking pack mule. "We will not be here at dawn," Elowen said, her voice surprisingly steady. The food and the mint tea had restored her, but it was the purpose, the map, the action, that had truly brought her back. Sutton nodded once. He led the animals not to the main entrance of the hollow, but to the back, where the creek disappeared into a narrow fissure in the rock. The creek bed is the path. It is called the Dry Lantern Wash. It is a river in spring, a road in summer. He led Arrow into the dark, shallow water. Elowen scrambled up onto a rock and he gave her a hand, pulling her up behind him onto the saddle. She sat astride, her legs bunched up, her arms wrapping around his waist. She flinched at the solid, unyielding feel of his back, but he seemed not to notice her touch, or to mind it. He nudged Arrow forward into the dark, watery canyon. The mule followed. They moved without a torch, Sutton navigating by the feel of the current against the horse's legs and the faint, starlit line of the canyon rim high above. They traveled this way for perhaps an hour. The canyon walls were so close they could have touched them. Then the walls widened, and Sutton reined in the horse. They were in a small, sandy clearing. He slid from the saddle, and Elowen nearly fell after him, her muscles stiff. He walked to the mule. From his pocket, he took a small, brass bell, the kind a shopkeeper might have. He tied it securely to the mule's tail. Then he unslung his duster, the one he had used to cover her, and tied it firmly across the mule's empty pack saddle, making a bulky, human-like shape in the dark. He gave the mule a sharp, stinging slap on the rump. "Get!" he growled. The mule, startled and annoyed by the bell, trotted off, but it did not follow them. Sutton had pointed it south, down a fork in the canyon that led back toward the open basin. They, he had explained, were going north. The bell, jingling with every step, would carry in the night air. It was a false trail, a ghost for Cray's men to chase. Sutton listened until the faint tink-tink-tink was gone. He will follow the sound. It will buy us 2 hours. He turned and looked at Eowyn. From here, we walk. The ground is soft, and the horse is for when we run. He led, she followed, her hand often on Arrow's saddle to keep her balance. The boots were clumsy, and her feet swam in them. The wash was no longer a creek bed. It had opened into a wide, flat marsh, a place of sucking mud and ankle-deep. Stagnant water. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the high, thin whine of mosquitoes. The true danger, however, lay under the water. The bog was choked with the sharp, pointed roots of dead cypress trees. Knees that were like submerged spikes. Eowyn, unused to the terrain, stumbled, her foot catching on a root she could not see. She cried out, a small, sharp sound, as she fell forward, the muddy water soaking her to the hip. Sutton was on her in an instant, not to comfort, but to silence. His hand clamped over her mouth, not gently. He pulled her up, his face inches from hers in the dark. No sound, he hissed. None. She nodded, wide-eyed, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had been right to silence her, because in the distance, a sound answered her cry. A whistle. A single, high-pitched note, like a bird call. It was a signal. And then the sound they both dreaded: horses, moving fast, not the single ambling trot of the decoy mule. This was the rhythmic, pounding drum of a posse. They did not take the bait. Sutton whispered. He grabbed her hand. Run! They plunged through the bog. All pretense of stealth gone. The water splashed. The mud sucked at Eowyn's boots, but Sutton dragged her forward, his strength inhuman. He seemed to know every solid patch of ground, every trap. He hauled her over a rotten log, through a curtain of hanging moss, and she saw it. Ahead, a dark, heavy shape loomed. A bridge, an old wooden railroad bridge, part of a spur that had been abandoned years ago, crossing the arroyo. The torch, Sutton commanded, his voice tight. He had lit a single, pitch-soaked torch to navigate the worst of the bog, and it now made them a perfect target. Eowyn fumbled with the matches in her pocket, her hands slick with mud. But Sutton did not wait. He grabbed the torch from its brace on the saddle, inverted it, and plunged it into the muddy water. The hiss and puff of steam were violent. Darkness, absolute and terrifying, fell upon them. Sutton's hand found her arm in the blackness. Down, under. He pulled her down the slick embankment, sliding on the mud, and pushed her into the cramped, low space beneath the bridge. The air was foul, smelling of bat guano and wet, rotting wood. The massive timbers of the bridge were just inches above their heads. They pressed their backs against the cold. Stone abutment, arrow, trained to perfection, stood without a sound, his body a solid black shape next to them, blending with the shadows. Eowyn was shaking, but it was not from fear. It was from the cold, muddy water that soaked her clothes. Her teeth chattered. Sutton put a hand on her shoulder, a silent command to be still. The horses were close. They could hear the creak of leather, the jingle of a bit, the low, angry voices of men. I tell you, I heard me, one man said. Right here. You heard a heron, you fool. A deeper, colder voice answered. Sheriff Hollis Cray. Eowyn's face was pressed against Sutton's chest. She had put it there instinctively, to muffle the sound of her own breathing. She could feel his heart. It was not racing. It was slow, steady. Thump, thump, thump. The calm beat of a man who had been in worse places than this. The man with the rope scar. A beam of light sliced through the darkness. One of them had a lantern. The light swept across the arroyo, illuminating the muddy, disturbed water. It moved slowly, painting the cypress roots and the slick banks. Eowyn held her breath. The light was moving toward them. It swept across Arrow's legs, but the horse stood like a statue. The light climbed, catching the edge of the bridge, and then it stopped. The beam was pointing directly at their hiding spot. It illuminated a small, pale shape, a piece of cloth. It was the rag Eloan had used to stuff the toe of her boot, which had fallen out when she slid down the bank. It was white, stark, and utterly damning. What is that?" the first man said. The lantern lifted. Eloan saw the silhouette of a man peering down, his hat low. He was less than 10 feet away. He was almost on top of them. Time stopped. Eloan's heart, which had been pounding, seemed to freeze. Sutton's body tensed. He did not reach for his rifle. He slowly, silently, drew the long, heavy skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. He was not preparing to shoot his way out. He was preparing to kill the man who dropped down to investigate. The man on the bridge took a step, and from the crevices in the stone abutment, disturbed by the light and the sudden silence, a different kind of life exploded. A cloud of bats, 100 strong, poured from the darkness under the bridge. A chaotic, leathery shriek. The man with the lantern yelled, throwing his arm up to protect his face. The lantern swung wildly, casting insane, dancing shadows. "Damnation, bats! I hate these things. It is a rag, you idiot." Cray's voice snapped, full of disgust. "He is not here. He is playing with us. He sent us south with that mule. Now he is heading north, to the passes. Move!" The lantern beam swung away. The men cursed, turned their horses, their voices fading as they galloped back the way they had come, heading for a different crossing. For a full 5 minutes, Sutton and Eloan did not move. They stayed pressed against the stone, the only sound the slow drip of water and the fading thump-thump-thump of the horses. Finally, Sutton let out a long, slow breath. It was the first sign of tension he had shown. He released his grip on the knife. His hand, still on Eloan's shoulder, was heavy. Eloan realized her face was still buried in his shirt. She could smell the faint, clean scent of juniper and soap, mixed with the sweat of their run. She pulled back, embarrassed, but he did not seem to notice. "They are gone," she whispered. "They are ahead," he corrected her, his voice a low rumble. "They know our direction. Now it is a race." He led them from under the bridge, crawling up the bank, his hand on Arrow's bridle. They did not ride. They stayed in the deep gully, following the arroyo on foot, the mud replaced by loose gravel that was treacherous in the dark. They walked for another hour, the race against the dawn. Eloan was moving on pure adrenaline. Her legs were numb. Her borrowed boots were rubbing her ankles raw, and she was freezing. The cold was a deep, invasive thing, and she began to shiver violently, her teeth chattering so hard she had to clench her jaw. Sutton stopped. He looked back, his face a pale mask in the starlight. He saw her shaking. He let out a sigh, a sound of profound annoyance, but it was not directed at her. It was directed at the situation, at her weakness, at the inconvenience of it all. He pushed on, faster this time, until he reached a break in the gully wall, a path almost invisible. He led the horse up it. At the top was a small, ruined structure, the collapsed stone walls of an old sheep pen, probably abandoned for 50 years. It offered little shelter, but it was out of the wind. Sutton pointed. "In." Eloan stumbled into the ruin, huddling behind a low wall. Sutton unsaddled Arrow, his movements quick. From one of the saddlebags, he pulled a thick, wool-lined duster, a cleaner, heavier one than his decoy. He tossed it at her. "Put it on." She fumbled with it, her fingers stiff and useless. She could not work the buttons. The shaking was too bad. Sutton knelt in front of her. He let out another sigh, this one closer to exasperation. "Give me your hands." She held them out. They were covered in mud, and in the faint light, he saw the dark line of a cut across her right palm, where she had fallen on a sharp rock. He said nothing. He took her hands, one at a time, and poured a small amount of water from his canteen over them, washing away the mud and the blood. The water was cold, and she winced. He did not apologize. He simply took a clean strip of cloth from his bag and, with surprising gentleness, wrapped her palm. His calloused, rough fingers were precise, the bandage tight and professional. He did not release her hands. He held them, rubbing them briskly between his own, his palms like rough sandpaper generating a surprising heat. When he was satisfied, he took the duster and, as if dressing a child, pushed her arms into the sleeves. He drew the heavy coat around her, the wool lining instantly trapping her small warmth. He did the buttons himself, his large fingers working the toggles with slow, deliberate care. Elowen sat, mute, as he worked. She was huddled inside a coat that smelled of him. The shivering began to subside, replaced by a profound exhaustion. He had saved her. Twice, he had fed her. He had clothed her. He had cleaned her wound. He had hidden her. He had shared his warmth. She looked at him in the dark, this quiet, scarred man, and a realization settled on her. "You have not asked me," she said, her voice muffled by the thick collar. He finished the top button and sat back on his heels, his work done. "Asked you what? Why? You never asked me why I took the book. If it was worth it, if I am lying. You never asked." Sutton Rook looked at the ruined walls around them, at the pale moon beginning to sink in the west. He seemed to consider the question not as a moral puzzle, but as a practical one. "Why does not matter," he said, his voice flat. "Why is a rock you trip on when you are running? I do not care why, I care how." He tapped his temple. "How to get over the ridge, how to keep the horse quiet, how to get you to stop shaking so you can walk." He stood up, a tall, dark shape against the stars. "We have 2 hours until light. Get sleep." He turned and walked to the edge of the ruin, taking the first watch. Elowen stared at his back. He did not ask why. He only did how. And in that moment, in that cold, ruined pen, she knew she had put her life, and the ledger, in the hands of the only man west of the Pecos who might actually get them both to Sable Junction alive. The sheepfold was a small, crumbling circle of stones, roofed over with rotted timbers and sod. It offered little protection from the wind, but it was out of the direct path of the arroyo. The air was thick with the smell of old wool, lanolin, and damp earth. It was the scent of decades of livestock seeking refuge, and it was, strangely, a comfort. Sutton had built a small, contained fire in a dented charcoal brazier. He pulled from his saddlebag a piece of kit Elowen never would have thought to carry. It produced little smoke and a surprising amount of focused heat. They sat close to it, their knees almost touching, the small, reddish glow painting their faces in flickering warmth. The steady, heavy rain drummed on the sod roof, a constant, rushing sound that isolated them from the rest of the world. Their breath plumed in the cold air, small, white clouds that vanished into the darkness. For a long time, the only sound was the rain and the crackle of the charcoal. Elowen, swaddled in Sutton's heavy duster, finally felt the deep, invasive cold recede from her bones. She felt her mind clear, the fog of exhaustion and fear replaced by the sharp, cold clarity of their situation. She looked at Sutton. He was staring into the flames, his profile like something carved from the local rock. He was a man of how, not why. She knew, instinctively, that if he was to continue risking his life, he needed to understand the how of the thing she carried. She reached into the saddlebag beside her, her bandaged hand brushing against the hardtack. She pulled out the oilcloth bundle. He did not look up, but she saw his body tense, his attention shifting from the fire to her. She unwrapped it carefully, the deer hide and the oilcloth, and laid the ledger open on her lap. The firelight was just bright enough. "I need to show you," she said, her voice quiet, absorbed by the sound of the rain. "I need you to see what I see." He turned his head. His pale eyes were unreadable in the low light. She pointed with a finger that was still raw. "My mother said numbers do not lie. Pike and Torney are counting on that. They are just hoping no one speaks their language." She guided his gaze. "He is not stupid. He did not write bribe in the margin. He uses 2 columns, this one." She tapped a column of modest figures. "He calls freight adjustments, this one." She tapped another. Is surveyor consultations. But look. She flipped a few pages. Here. The day the Willow Flats claim was condemned by the judge, the same day. An entry appears in this column for $300, and in this column, an entry for $30. Sutton leaned closer, the movement reluctant, but he was captured. The $30 is the real bribe, paid to the county surveyor. The $300, that is the dirty money. It is the payment from Silas Torn, the railroad man, to Judge Pike, but he does not get it directly. She traced the line. Every time a payment is logged, these other entries appear within an hour or two. One at the general store, one at the feed lot, one at the saloon. Small amounts, payment for supplies, feed order, bar tab. They are washing it. They are moving the money through 3 separate shops, breaking it into pieces so it looks like normal commerce. Her voice was steady, the voice of a teacher, an accountant. Pike is skimming 10% for himself off of every water claim Torna steals. He is using the town's own businesses to hide the theft that is killing the town. Sutton was silent. He looked at the book, then at her. He understood. He understood the intricate, hateful mechanism of it. It was a machine, just like his water wheel. But this one was designed to grind men into dust. He sat back, his gaze returning to the fire. He picked up a small stick and poked the charcoal, his face a mask of old, settled anger. "A machine," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They build a machine of paper to steal what rock and water should give freely." He was quiet for so long that Elowen thought he had retreated, that he was gone from her. The rain hammered the roof, a sudden, violent squall passing over. Then he spoke, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear it. "They used paper on me, too." His scarred hand, the one that had held the cup to her lips, lifted. He did not look at it, but his other hand went to his own throat, a purely unconscious gesture. "Mesa Fortuna, the town square," he said. The words were stones dropped into a deep well. "I was not always in the hollow. I had a small spread, south of town. I had neighbors. I had a wife." Elowen's breath caught. 4 tin cups. "She died," he said, the words flat, admitting no grief, only fact. "Fever. The ground was hard. I buried her myself. After that, I suppose I was not good company. I kept to myself. And when a man is alone, he is an easy target." He looked at Elowen. "Henderson, a big rancher, claimed I was rustling his cattle, said I was rebranding. He was losing maybe 10% of his stock to a new sickness, but he found it easier to blame a man than the fever. He and his foreman found a calf with my brand burned over theirs. A sloppy job. A child could see it was a lie." He paused, the memory settling in the small, warm space. They did not wait for the circuit judge. Cray was there. He read the law from a piece of paper. Henderson brought the rope. He touched the scar on his wrist. This was from the binding, the other. He touched his neck. "They threw the rope over the beam of the land office. They did it. They kicked the wagon." Elowen made a small, wounded sound, her hand flying to her own mouth. "It was a bad knot." Sutton continued, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. A man reciting a fact. "The foreman tied it. He was a cattleman, not a hangman. It slipped. It did not break my neck. It just held. I hung there. For a full minute, I suppose, listening to them argue about whose turn it was to shoot me." He stared at the fire. "My wife's brother, Ramon, the man who runs the stables. He and his friends. They were the only ones who spoke up. They cut me down. They had guns. The mob did not enough of them. Anyway." He let out a long, slow breath. Cray backed down, said it was justice deferred. A week later, the real rustler was caught. Henderson's own foreman. He got drunk in a saloon 20 miles away and bragged about how he had planned to buy my land cheap at auction after I was dead. He tossed the stick into the fire. It sparked. I left the town, the square, the people. I came here. The land does not lie. The water does not pass judgment. It just is. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Elowen now understood the hollow. She understood the isolation, the lack of why. He had seen why turn into a rope. From the darkest corner of the sheepfold, a sound erupted, a loud, wet, guttural. It was followed by a content, bubbling groan. Elowen startled, her head whipping toward the sound. Huddled in the shadows was a single, ancient sheep, a ewe with a gray muzzle and one horn, who had apparently been in residence when they arrived. She was fast asleep, dreaming, without a care in the world. A sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped Elowen's throat. It was a fragile, hysterical bubble of sound. She clapped her hand over her mouth again. But it was too late. The sheer, absurd domesticity of it, two fugitives. A hangman's story, and a snoring sheep broke her. She looked at Sutton. His face was frozen. He stared at the sheep. The sheep snorted again, its leg kicking in a dream. The corner of Sutton Rook's mouth, the side that was not scarred by sun, quirked. It was not a smile. It was the memory of one. It was a tiny, rusted upward pull of muscle, and it was the most beautiful thing Elowen had ever seen. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and they shared this one. Tiny, perfect, ridiculous moment. The fear, the running, the dread. For 1 second, it was held at bay by a snoring sheep, and then the sky tore open. The squall that had been threatening turned into a deluge. The wind howled, and a blast of icy rain shot through a gap in the stone wall, dousing the edge of their fire and spraying Elowen with a needle-sharp, freezing water. She cried out, huddling deep into the duster, but the cold was immediate and violent. She began to shiver, her body betraying her, the small warmth they had built instantly stolen. Sutton's faint smile vanished. He was a man of how again. The shiver was a problem to be solved. He moved, shifting his body to block the wind. It was not enough. She was shaking too hard, her teeth chattering. He looked at her, his face grim. He shifted closer. Then, he lifted his right arm, the one with the scarred wrist. He held it out, not touching her, the arm hovering in the small space between them. It was a question. It was a gesture of such profound, hesitant courtesy that it made Elowen's heart ache. This man, who had been brutalized by the world, was asking permission to offer comfort. She did not trust her voice. She just gave a small, jerky nod. He seemed to hesitate for 1 more second, as if unfamiliar with the mechanics of the movement. And then he acted. He put his arm around her shoulders. It was an awkward, stiff embrace, man and wood. But then he pulled. He did not pull her to him. He pulled her into his shelter. He drew her against his side, his arm a solid bar, and with his other hand, he grabbed the edges of the heavy duster and wrapped it around her, then around himself, creating a shared cocoon of wool and human warmth. Elowen's head landed on his chest. She froze, her cheek pressed against the rough cotton of his shirt. It was a hard, unyielding pillow. He was all bone and tight muscle, and he was warm. She could smell the clean scent of juniper from his cabin, the faint trace of wood smoke, and the simple, honest smell of sweat beneath her ear. She heard it. His heart. Thump, thump, thump. It was the same, steady, slow beat she had heard under the bridge. It was the rhythm of a man who was not afraid. It was the sound of bedrock. Her own heart, which had been racing with the cold and the fear, seemed to listen. It slowed, matching his rhythm. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 days. Her shivering did not stop, but it lessened, subdued by the steady, solid heat of his body. She felt her eyes grow heavy. She was exhausted, but for the first time since she had seen the 2 ledgers, she felt, in this ruined shelter, in the arms of a scarred stranger, utterly safe. They sat like that for a long time. The firelight played in his eyes. He was staring at the wall, his jaw tight, as if holding a heavy weight. She did not know if the weight was her, or his past, or the storm. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was muffled against his chest, soft as the old wool. Sutton did not answer. He just gave a single, awkward, jerking nod against the top of her head. The world existed in that small, warm space. The rain, the ledger, the men, they were all outside. Then a flash of brilliant, blue-white light illuminated the entire shelter, stark as day. It was followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the stones. In that single, frozen moment of lightning, Elowen saw Sutton's eyes. They were not looking at her, or the fire. They were fixed, wide and suddenly alert, on the mud by the ruined doorway. He had seen something. Before the darkness rushed back in, her own eyes followed his, in the mud. Clear as a photograph was a single, fresh hoofprint, not the heavy, splayed print of Sutton's horse, or the small, cloven print of a sheep. This was a neat, shod hoof, and beside it, half filled with water, was the clear, deep impression of a man's boot. Someone had been there. Someone had stood in the doorway, looked in at them, and left. Sutton's arm, which had been a comfort, became a bar of steel, pressing her down. He was here. Sutton's voice was a barely audible hiss, all warmth gone. "He found us. Cray," she breathed, her newfound safety shattering. "His scout. He knows we are holed up. He will not come for us in this. He will wait for dawn, and he will have us pinned." Sutton was already moving, disentangling himself from her, his warmth leaving her instantly cold. He kicked dirt onto the brazier, the coals hissing in protest. "We are not waiting for dawn," he said, his voice flat and hard in the sudden, total darkness. "We leave now." "But the storm," she protested. "Where can we go?" He grabbed the saddlebags. "Sparrow's Pass. It is a goat track, a razor cut in the mountains. No one would be stupid enough to take it at night, in a storm." He stopped, and she could feel, rather than see, his grim smile. "That is why we will." Sparrow's Pass was not a road. It was a scar, a high, narrow fissure in the rock that the wind had scraped clean. The storm, which had begun as rain, had died for an hour, lulling them into a false sense of security. Then, from the west, the wind turned. It did not just blow, it shrieked. It came up the pass like a solid wall, carrying the high desert with it. The rain was gone, replaced by a stinging, blinding, suffocating cloud of alkali dust and sand. It was an explosion of grit that turned the pre-dawn darkness into a roaring, abrasive hell. "Cover your face!" Sutton's voice was a bellow, but the wind tore the words from his mouth, and Elowen only heard a snatch of it. She pulled the wool duster up over her head, but it was useless. The sand was too fine. It found every gap, stinging her eyes, filling her mouth with mud, making every breath a painful, choking effort. Arrow, their horse, screamed, a high, terrified sound, and reared, turning his back to the invisible assault. Here, Sutton was off the horse, pulling her down. He was a dark shape in a swirling, brown-red world. He had seen it a blacker shadow in the rock face, a crack, a fissure in the basalt. He did not ask. He grabbed her arm and half threw, half shoved her toward it. She fell forward, crawling the last 2 feet, tumbling into a narrow, dark space. It was a cave, or perhaps just a deep, tectonic split in the mountain. It was triangular, high and narrow, and it smelled of dry stone and old, cold air. Sutton fell in after her, pulling the saddlebags with him, followed by Arrow, who lunged into the opening, grateful for any reprieve. The horse's bulk, packed into the entrance, created a partial, trembling wall against the worst of the storm. Outside, the wind howled, a rising, tearing shriek that sounded like 1,000 steam whistles. It was a physical, pressing weight of sound. Inside, the world was reduced to a small, dark pocket of silence and panting. Elowen collapsed against the wall, her body giving out. She was choking. The grit was in her throat, her lungs. She was hit by a racking, dry cough that shook her entire frame, a painful, scraping spasm that brought tears to her eyes. She could not get her breath. She felt, rather than saw, Sutton move. He was a creature of how. This was a problem. He unhooked his canteen, the sound of the metal clip loud in the small space. He fumbled in his pack, his hands sure and practiced in the dark. A moment later, a small, wet cloth touched her face. She flinched, a small, animal sound. "It is just water," his voice rumbled. Close. He did not hand it to her. He knew her hands were shaking, that she was spent. He held the wet bandana himself. His other hand, the one with the rope scar, came up and cupped the back of her head, a gesture of pure, unthinking practicality, holding her still as a father might a child. His fingers were rough, the calluses like polished wood, but the motion was impossibly careful. He wiped the dust from her forehead. He cleaned the grit from around her eyes, his thumb gentle on the delicate skin. He moved down, tracing her cheekbones, his touch sure. The cold, clean water was a shock, a blessing. She had stopped coughing, her breath coming in shuddering gasps, her eyes wide open in the dark, watching his silhouette. He moved the cloth lower, to her neck where the dust had caked into a muddy paste. He was methodical. He was just cleaning a wound, solving a problem, but his fingers, tracing the line of her throat, were warm. They brushed the pulse that hammered there. A frantic bird in a cage. He stopped. His hand was still on her neck. The cloth was still. He was not cleaning anymore. The wind outside hit a new, keening pitch, a long, mournful cry that seemed to shake the stone around them, and in the cramped, borrowed darkness, their eyes, which had adjusted to the near black, found each other. It was not like the look in the sheepfold, a moment of shared, surprised humor. This was something else. Their gaze, which had begun as a practical check, "Are you breathing?" held. It was a look that lasted 1 second, then 2, then 10. It was a look that held because, in that moment, the storm, the men, the ledger, and the entire, hateful running world had vanished. There was nothing left but this small, dark space, the roar of the wind, and the feel of his rough hand on her skin. Elowen's body was a single, raw nerve. She was aware of everything, the cold stone at her back, the smell of wet dust and his faint juniper scent, the massive, warm presence of the horse beside them, and the hard, focused weight of his gaze. He did not move. He was a man locked in iron, a man who had left the world, who had been betrayed by touch and law, and why? He would not move, so she did, slowly. Her own hand, the one he had bandaged, came up. She did not grab him. She did not cling. She simply laid her palm, flat, on the back of his hand, the one that was still cupped against her throat. The contact was electric. She felt the muscle in his arm jump, a sudden, sharp intake of energy. His skin was hot, his hand hard as a blacksmith's. "I am tired," she whispered. The words were almost impossible to hear. A small confession to his shirt. "Sutton, I am so tired of running." It was an admission of complete, terrifying vulnerability. It was the last wall she had, and she was letting it fall. She was not just a mind carrying a ledger. She was a body, and it was broken. Sutton's breath, which had been steady, hitched. He looked at her small, bandaged hand resting on his scarred, larger one. He saw the trust, and he saw the cost. He leaned his forehead against hers, a slow, deliberate movement. His other hand, the one that had held her head, moved down, sliding from her hair to her shoulder, his grip tightening. His breath was warm against her lips, smelling of mint tea and coffee. "Then we will stop," he whispered, his voice a low, rough growl. "And if we cannot stop, then from now on, we run together." It was a vow. It was the only one he could make, the only one that mattered. It was a promise of how, and it was everything. Her world, which had been a spinning, terrifying race, found its axis. It was him. He did not kiss her. Not then. He just held her, his forehead pressed to hers, their breath mingling in the small space between their lips. He was giving her a chance to pull away. He was giving himself a chance. She did not pull away. She tilted her chin, a movement of less than an inch. The kiss, when it came, was as slow as the desert sunrise. It was not a kiss of fire and demand. It was a kiss of profound, desperate, and unutterable relief. It was his lips, chapped and dry, brushing hers. A question. It was her lips, soft and parted. Answering. It was a soft, deep, unhurried press. It tasted of dust and cold water and the faintest hint of tobacco from a pipe he no longer smoked. It was a kiss that was not about taking, but about finding. It was the first act of stillness either of them had known in days. He pulled back, just enough to see her eyes, a shadow in the shadows. The wind shrieked, as if in protest. A small, impossible smile touched his lips, the one she had seen in the sheepfold, but this one was real. It was a smile of pure, astonished discovery. She smiled back, a tear tracing a new path down her dusty cheek. He whispered her name. Elowen. Just the word. It was an anchor in the storm. Sutton, she breathed back, her fingers tightening on his hand. He came back, and this time the kiss was deeper. It was not rough, but it was sure. It was a claiming. It was the full, firm, warm press of his mouth, a gesture that said, "We are here, we are alive." It was a quiet, controlled passion, a shared breath, a promise that held no why, only us. When they finally broke apart, they did not move far. They stayed, foreheads touching, a new, shared warmth pulsing between them. He drew her in, his arms wrapping around her, and she burrowed into his chest, her arms sliding around his waist. Her small hands splayed flat against the hard muscle of his back. His hands moved, tracing the line of her spine, a slow, comforting, respectful caress. His touch was a statement. I am here. I am solid. I will not break. His hands stopped, one resting on her shoulder, the other at the small of her back, a gesture of pure, safe, and powerful protection. It was close, but gentle, a passion held firmly in check by a man who knew what it was to have his world shatter. Elowen laid her head on his chest. She heard it again, the heart, thump, thump, thump. It was faster now, but it was still steady. It was the sound of his life, and she was, for the first time, a part of it. She felt a shudder go through him, a long, deep sigh he had been holding in since the day they put the rope around his neck. He relaxed, his head resting on top of hers, and they just stood. They stood locked together in the dark, a single, two-backed shape against the storm, while the horse breathed heavy beside them. Outside, the world howled. The sand and grit beat against the stone, a million tiny fists. Inside the cave, there was only the steady heat and the slow, shared breath. The storm raged for what felt like hours, but in their small, dark world, the center was perfectly, wonderfully calm. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sound changed. The high-pitched, tearing shriek began to fade. The wind was still blowing, but the sand was no longer flying. The air was clearing. Sutton felt it first. He stiffened, his head lifting. He was listening. The assault was over. Elowen, feeling him tense, pulled back, though her hands stayed on his chest. "It is stopping," she whispered. "It is moving on," he said, his voice still thick. He did not let her go. Not completely. His hand was still on her back. They stood for another minute, listening to the wind die. The horse, sensing the change, shifted, whickering softly. The world was returning. The how was returning. Sutton finally, reluctantly, let his arms drop. He took her hand, the one on his chest, and squeezed it. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a signal. It is time to move. She squeezed back. "I am ready." He turned. "All business now." Checking the horse, resecuring the saddlebags. He was the man of action once more, but as he moved to the mouth of the cave, he paused. He looked back at her. The light was just beginning to touch the pass, a cold, gray pre-dawn. He could see her face clearly for the first time, the dust, the tear tracks, the swollen lips, and the exhaustion. But he also saw the new, steady set of her jaw. She was not the same woman he had found in the desert. He did not smile. He just nodded. once. And as they stepped out of the cave, leading the horse into the cold, scoured dawn, they did not touch. They did not need to. A promise had been made in the dark, and it would hold in the light. Kestrel Station was not a town. It was a scar, just like the pass they had descended. A collection of 3 sun-blasted buildings huddled around a telegraph pole and a dry well. It was a place for changing horses, not for living, but it had paper, ink, and, in its small, fly-bothered store, a single, withered lemon. They had been riding for 2 days since the sandstorm, a silent, focused ride that had left the events in the cave unspoken. The kiss hung between them, a tangible thing, but the urgency of the ledger and the men behind them had priority. They were partners now, in a way that went beyond words, and the intimacy of the cave had transformed into a seamless, unspoken teamwork. While Sutton saw to the horse and spoke in low tones to the station master, Elowen went to work. She found a small, quiet room, the station's defunct guest parlor, and locked the door. She had the original ledger, the charcoal pencil from Sutton's pack, and the lemon. First, she made the insurance. She took a clean sheet of foolscap. She dipped a clean quill nib into the sour juice of the lemon. Then, with the meticulous, practiced hand of an accountant, she began to copy. She did not copy the whole book. She copied the pattern. She traced the key columns, the dates of the land condemnations, and the exact corresponding figures of the consulting fees. To the naked eye, she was just tracing grooves onto a blank page, but she knew that when this page was held over a flame, the acid would brown, and the numbers Pike's guilt would scream from the page. She folded this invisible confession and tucked it deep within her bodice, separate from the ledger itself. Second, she took a different sheet and the charcoal. She laid it over the ledger's most damning page, the one showing the 5-figure transfer from the railroad to Pike, laundered through the town's shops, and began to rub. She used the side of the charcoal, her fingers pressing hard, creating a crude, spectral image of the page. It was a dark, ghostly negative, but the figures were legible. It was a copy. It was proof. When Sutton returned, he found her rolling the 2 new pages. He simply nodded, accepting her part of the work. "Arrow is spent," he said, his voice low. "We cannot get to Sable Junction on him, not with them pushing us." "And if they are waiting in Sable Junction?" she asked, her mind following the strategic lines. "They know it is our destination? It is a trap." "It is," he agreed. He looked at his hands, and she knew he was thinking of his wife's brother, the man who had cut him down. "We are not going to Sable Junction. Not yet. We are going back." Elowen's blood ran cold. "Back to Mesa Fortuna. They will not look for us there. Not now. They think we are running from it. We will hide in the wolf's den." He met her gaze. "I have a friend. Ramon Tejada. He runs the livery. He owes me." "The man who saved you," she whispered. He nodded once. "He is the only man in Mesa Fortuna I trust with my life. He is the only one I will trust with yours." Ramon Tejada was a man made of old leather and silver hair, his face a map of kindness and hard-won wisdom. He met them not at the main livery, but at a broken-down line shack 5 miles south of town, as instructed by a note Sutton had left in a pre-arranged hollow log. When Ramon saw Sutton, his eyes, which had seen everything, filled with a deep, pained affection. He embraced Sutton, not as a friend, but as a son. "You are a fool to come back, Mojo," he whispered, his voice rough. "Cray has tripled his deputies. He is paying $50 for information on you. Dead." "He will not find me," Sutton said. "I need horses. Ramon, 3 of them, fresh, and a wagon. Something old, something that looks like it is falling apart." Ramon looked at Elowen, his gaze assessing. He saw the trousers, the exhaustion, and the unshakable resolve in her eyes. He had seen that look before, in Sutton, the day he was cut down. "And her?" Ramon asked. "She is with me," Sutton said. The words were simple, but they were absolute. She is my responsibility. She is my own. Ramon held Sutton's gaze. A wagon and horses. You will be. We are a broke, drifting couple, Sutton said, the plan clear in his head. We have honey to sell. We are too poor to be a threat and too tired to be noticed. An hour later, they were a different pair. Arrow was hidden in a deep, brush-filled arroyo, left to graze and recover. In his place was a sway-backed, tired-looking freight wagon, its canvas cover stained and patched. It was pulled by two equally unimpressive mules. A third, stronger horse was tied to the back, hidden under a tarp. The wagon bed, Ramon had shown them, was loaded with 20-gallon jugs of dark, pungent mesquite honey. My cousins, Ramon had said, tapping a jug. You are just his poor relations, trying to sell it for him in town. It is a good cover. It gives you a reason to be at the market, a reason to move slow. They were transformed. Elowen now wore a faded calico dress, provided by Ramon's wife. Sutton wore the overalls of a dirt-poor farmer. They were, to all the world, Mr. and Mrs. Rook, two more souls beaten down by the desert, come to town to sell their only goods. They entered Mesa Fortuna at dusk, part of a line of other wagons heading in for the night market. They passed two of Cray's deputies. The men glanced at them, at the rickety wagon, the jugs of honey, and the woman's exhausted, down-turned face. They sneered and waved them on. They were invisible. They set up their stall in the noisiest, most crowded part of the square, the very square where Sutton had been hung. He did not look at the land office, his face set like stone as he unhitched the mules. I need to move, Elowen said, her voice taut. She had her own plan. She carried the small, rolled-up letter written in lemon juice. Where? The church. Father O'Malley's. He spoke out against the railroad's first water proposal. He said it was a sin against God's given green. He is the only one who has been brave enough. Go, Sutton said. Be a shadow. She slipped away, blending into the crowd of shoppers and wives. The church was dark, but a side door to the rectory was open. She moved inside, her heart a drum. She did not know where to leave the note. She saw his desk, covered in papers, a stack of church bulletins for the coming Sunday. She slid the invisible letter between page 4 and page 5 of the top bulletin. It was a shot in the dark, a prayer. She had to trust that he would find it, that he would know to hold it to a candle, that he would understand. She returned to the wagon. Sutton was gone. For a terrible, cold second, she panicked. Then she saw him, a hunched shape in overalls, listening near the big, noisy steam pump that fed the town's water troughs. He was not just listening, he was watching. Silas Torn, the railroad man, was there, his fine eastern suit a stark contrast to the mud, and with him was Sheriff Hollis Cray. They were not hiding. They believed they owned the night. And you are certain? Sheriff Torney was saying, his voice a clipped, arrogant bark over the pump's hiss chunk. It is set, Cray said. My man at the main dam, he closes the sluice gate at 9 o'clock. Sharp. The creek will be dry by 9:30. These ranchers, he laughed, a dry, ugly sound. They will be in Pike's office for the contract meeting, and they will hear the pump go dry. They will hear the troughs go silent. Their cattle will be screaming for water by morning, and Judge Pike will offer them his solution, Torna said, smiling. His new railroad-managed water utility, at a 300% premium. They will sign, Cray said. They will sign their land, their cattle, and their firstborns over to you just for a drink. It is beautiful. Mr. Torn, a beautiful piece of business. Sutton slipped back to the wagon, his face a pale, furious mask in the lantern light. He told Elowen what he had heard. 9 out. They were weaponizing the water tonight. The meeting is at the Red Bluff Town Hall, Elowen said, her mind racing, connecting the dots. That is where they will sign. We have to stop them. We have to show them the ledger. No, Sutton said, his voice flat. Showing them the ledger gets us shot. It is our word against Pike, Torney, and Cray, in a room full of guns. He looked at her, his eyes cold with a new, dangerous idea. "We cannot stop the meeting, but we can stop the drought." "But the dam," Elowen said. "It is miles away. We cannot—" "Not the main dam," Sutton said, his voice barely a whisper. He was thinking of his old map. "The old canal, the one the miners built, the Raven Cut, it is dry, but it has a sluice, an old, iron-toothed auxiliary valve that they boarded up 50 years ago. It is upstream from Pike's new dam. If we can get to it, if we can open that gate, it will bypass their dam completely. It will send the creek's full force down the old cut." "Where does it go?" she asked. "Straight to the Willow Flats," Sutton said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Straight to the old pastures. It will flood the very land they stole. It will bring water back to town, but not through their pump. It will fill the old wells. They will close the main gate, and the town will have more water than ever. It will expose their entire lie." "When?" "They close the gate at 9, Sutton said, looking at the sky. "We open ours at 9:01. They had a new plan. A plan of how— "One more thing," Elowen said, her eyes bright with a sudden, sharp idea of her own. "I have to go back, to the Emporium." "No," Sutton said, grabbing her arm. "It is too dangerous. Cray's men are everywhere. It is where my plan meets yours," she said, her voice urgent. "Your plan gives them water. My plan gives them justice. I saw it, Sutton, when I worked there, in the back office. Pike is arrogant. He leaves his things. He thinks no one would dare." He looked at her, at the fire in her, and he knew he could not stop her. 10 minutes, he growled. "I will be at the corner." She moved like a ghost. The Emporium's back office was dark. The door was unlocked. She slipped inside, the smell of ledgers and old ink filling her lungs. There it was, on a cluttered side desk, in a mahogany box with other official papers, a heavy brass and ivory stamp, the official town seal, the one Judge Pike used to notarize every document, to make every lie a law. She took it. It was heavy in her hand, a solid weight of power. She slipped it into the pocket of her calico dress, her heart hammering. This was the final piece. She was walking back, head down, a shadow in the crowded market. Just another farmer's wife. She was almost at the wagon, and a hand grabbed her arm. It was not Sutton. It was a large, meaty hand. She smelled whiskey and cheap tobacco. Well, a voice slurred. She looked up into the face of one of Cray's deputies, the same one who had watched her house that night. He was drunk, but his eyes were sharp. "I know you. You are the little number girl, the one who ran." His eyes widened in recognition, and his mouth opened to shout, "Cray!" Elowen did not scream. She stomped her hard boot down on his instep. The man roared, his grip loosening for a second. It was all Sutton needed. He had been watching. He moved not like a farmer, but like a cougar. He was on the man in 2 strides. He did not hit him. He grabbed the deputy from behind, one arm around his throat, and spun him, using his body as a shield, dragging him backward into the dark alley between the livery and the smithy. The man's shout had been heard. A whistle blew. The market, which had been a low hum, suddenly went quiet, then erupted in shouts. "There, by the wagon! It is Rook! It is Sutton Rook! Grab them!" Sutton reappeared from the alley, alone. The deputy was down. He did not run to Elowen. He ran to the horse tied at the back of the wagon. He untied it in one violent rip. "Elowen!" he bellowed. She was already running. He did not wait for her to mount. He grabbed her by the waist, his arm a steel band, and he threw her, bodily, onto the horse's bare back. He vaulted up behind her in the same motion, his legs grabbing the horse's flanks, the reins already in his hand. "Hold on!" he yelled. He drove his heels in. The horse, a strong, fresh-legged mare from Ramon's stable, sprang forward, scattering the crowd. A table of bright red apples went flying, the fruit rolling like a wave of blood under the hooves. People screamed and dived out of the way. A shot rang out, the bullet whining past Sutton's ear. He did not look back. He leaned low over the horse's neck. Elowen crushed between his arms and aimed for the darkness at the edge of town. They were out of the light, into the night, the shouts of the posse rising behind them like the howling of the storm. They had the seal, they had the plan, and they had 1 hour. The Red Bluff Town Hall was not a place of civic pride. It was a courtroom, a bank, and a theater. And tonight, Judge Bartholomew Pike was the star of his own production. He stood at the head of a long, polished oak table, his face a mask of solemn concern. Silas Torn sat beside him, a thin, satisfied smile on his lips, his fingers drumming on a stack of neatly piled contracts. Sheriff Hollis Cray stood by the door, his arms crossed, his badge a small, dull star in the lamplight. His presence was not for order. It was for intimidation. In the rough-hewn chairs sat the ranchers, 10 of them, their faces cracked with sun and worry. They were the backbone of Mesa Fortuna, and they were here to be broken. They were desperate. They were thirsty. The clock on the wall chimed, a thin, tinny sound. 9 o'clock, as if on cue, the steady, rhythmic hiss-chunk of the town's steam pump. A sound so constant it was part of the silence. Sputtered, it coughed, choked on air, and died. A profound, terrible silence fell over the room. The trap was sprung. One of the ranchers, a man named Henshaw, scraped his chair back. "The pump," he said, his voice a dry croak. "The creek's gone dry." "Indeed," Judge Pike said, his voice rich with false sympathy. "A tragedy. A drought upon us, as I feared." He gestured to the papers. "Which is why Mr. Torn and I have prepared this emergency contingency. A lifeline, gentlemen, for the town." "A lifeline," Henshaw spat. "That costs us 300% more for water that was ours yesterday. The railroad has resources." "My friend," Torna said, spreading his hands. "We have the engineers, the means. We are offering to save your farms for a modest management fee." Far above them, on the dark, windy ridge that overlooked the town, Sutton Rook saw the last light in the town hall go bright. He did not wait. He struck a match, his scarred hand steady, and touched it to the pile of oil-soaked brush he had prepared. The signal fire bloomed, a single, bright orange flower in the vast darkness. He watched it for a count of 10, a signal to the man he trusted most. Now, Ramon, now. Miles away, at the forgotten, boarded-up sluice of the Raven Cut. Ramon Tejada saw the distant star on the ridge. He turned to the 3 men with him, his own loyal stable hands. "Now," he bellowed. They put their shoulders to the massive, rusted iron lever. It was a relic, 50 years old, sealed with rust and neglect. It did not budge. Again, Ramon roared. They strained, their boots slipping in the mud, the veins in their necks standing out, with a sound like a gunshot. The rust broke, the ancient iron gears groaned, and the heavy wooden gate began to lift. 1 agonizing inch at a time, a trickle of water became a stream. And then, with a splintering crash, the old wood gave way, the full, cold, angry force of the Fortuna Creek, diverted from its new, false path, roared into the dry, ancient canal. It was a sound like thunder, a stampede of water thundering down the mountain, heading for the parched earth of Willow Flats. Back in the town hall, Judge Pike had just unstopped his inkwell. "Gentlemen," he said, "shall we begin the signing?" The main door of the hall opened. It was not a deputy. It was Elowen Vale. She was not the farmer's wife in calico. She was wearing her own dress, the one Sutton had cleaned, her hair pinned up as if for work. She looked like the accountant she was. In her hand, she carried not the heavy ledger, but a single, rolled sheet of paper. Cray moved, his hand dropping to his gun. "What is this? Get her out of here!" "Let her stay," Pike said, a magnanimous, cruel smile on his face. He looked at the ranchers. "Let us all see the thief who started this. What have you come for, child, a beg?" Elowen walked, not to the chairs, but directly to the head of the table. She did not look at Cray. She did not look at Torn. She looked at Judge Pike. "I came for your signature. Judge," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the silent room. She unrolled the paper and laid it on the table. It was the charcoal rubbing, the dark, ghostly copy of his own guilt. Pike stared at it. He laughed. It was a short, ugly bark. "This a child smudge? This is your proof." He was triumphant. He saw the ranchers watching. He saw her, alone and pathetic. He decided to play. "You are right," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "An official document must be notarized. It must be official." He turned, took his heavy brass and ivory seal from his bag. He lit a stick of red wax, dripped a perfect, glistening circle onto the bottom of the charcoal page. "You have come to see justice done. Elowen," he sneered. "And so it shall be." He raised the heavy seal, the symbol of his power, of the town's trust, and pressed it, hard, into the warm wax. He was authenticating his own crime. "There," he said, leaning back. "Is it legal enough for you?" "It is," Elowen said. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a bell. "You have just authenticated your own confession, Judge." And from a hidden, deep pocket in her skirt, she pulled the real ledger. She slammed it down on the table, next to the charcoal copy, flipping it open to the matching page. "And now," she said, her voice rising, "we have a matched set." In that exact, frozen moment, a new sound entered the room. A low, distant rumble. Not thunder, not horses. It was the sound of water. Henshaw, the rancher, was closest to the window. He looked out. His face, which had been a mask of despair, went slack with confusion. "What in God's name?" A roar went up from the town square. Not a roar of anger, a roar of joy. "Water!" a voice screamed from the street. "The old well, the Willow Flats well is full!" The ranchers stampeded to the window, shoving, fighting to see. Outside, in the moonlight, they saw it. The dry, dusty canal that ran through the edge of town was a river. The old wells, long since dry, were overflowing, water pouring down the gutters. Their town, which had been choked to death 1 minute ago, was drowning in life. "You!" Torna shrieked, his face white, his eyes on the ledger. "You did this." "She did not," a cold voice said from the doorway. Cray spun, pulling his gun. He was fast, but he was not expecting it. "She will not be arrested. Sheriff," Elowen said, her voice like steel. "You!" Cray roared, his gun leveling, not at Elowen, but at the figure in the hallway. Sutton Rook stood there. He was not in overalls. He was in his duster, his hat low, his face in shadow. He was not holding a gun. He held the fire axe from the wall. Cray cocked the hammer. "Rook," he hissed. "I am taking you both." "No," Sutton said. He did not rush Cray. He took one step back, swung the axe in a powerful, glittering arc, and struck the heavy brass chain of the central oil lamp chandelier. The chain snapped. With a sound of tearing metal and shattering glass, the massive, burning chandelier crashed to the wooden floor, exploding in a whoosh of fire and thick, oily, black smoke. A wall of flame and smoke erupted, dividing the room. Cray yelled, blinded, his lungs full of soot. He fired his pistol, a panicky, wild shot that shattered the glass of the clock on the wall. He was coughing, lost in the smoke. The ranchers yelled, "Fire!" and backed away, their faces a mixture of terror and dawning, furious understanding. Silas Torn, the man of paper, saw his moment. He grabbed his briefcase of contracts, his only thought to escape. He ran for the side door, but in his panic, he did not see the crate of files Elowen had positioned by the wall. He tripped, his city shoes finding no purchase. He went down hard, his briefcase flying open, the box of files exploding. A white cloud of paper flew across the floor, settling at the feet of the astonished ranchers. Bank transfer slips, deeds, survey maps, all of it, spilled at their feet. And Elowen did not run. She stood in the choking smoke, the real ledger held high in one hand, the other pointing at the cowering Judge Pike. "He calls it a consulting fee," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. I call it the $300 he took to condemn the Willow Flats claim. He calls it a freight adjustment. Her fingers stabbed at the paper. I call it the 5-figure bribe from the railroad, laundered through the very shops you men own. She read the numbers. She read the dates. Her voice was the only sane thing in the room. A pillar of pure, cold fact. Pike was trapped behind his desk, the fire on one side, the furious ranchers on the other. His face was a mask of ashen terror. And then, the final sound. Dong, dong, dong. The great bronze bell of the church. It was not a call to prayer. It was not a fire alarm. It was the summons, the one Father O'Malley had reserved for the judgment of God. He had found the lemon juice note. He had lit a candle. He had seen the truth. The people, already in the streets celebrating the miracle of the water, heard the bell. They heard the gunshot. They saw the smoke. They surged, a single, angry, curious mass, toward the town hall, their torches and lanterns bright in the dark. Sutton appeared through the smoke, his face grim. He grabbed Elowen's arm. "That," he said, nodding to the bell, "is our exit." He pulled her toward the back hallway, leaving Pike, Torney, and Cray to the mercy of the town they had tried to murder. The smoke from the town hall, thick with the smell of burnt oil and scorched pine, poured into the night. But it could not choke the new sound of the town, the roar of water, drawn by the church bell, and the impossible, miraculous gurgle from the dry wells. The people of Mesa Fortuna had surged into the square. They were a confused, angry, joyous mob, their faces lit by the scattered embers and their own torches, turning from the overflowing troughs to the smoking building. And from that building, the ranchers, their face black with soot and a terrible, dawning comprehension, dragged the 3 architects of their ruin. Judge Pike, his robes torn and his face ashen. Silas torn, his fine eastern suit ruined, his briefcase of lies scattered. And Sheriff Hollis Cray, his badge dull with smoke, his eyes wide and feral. The crowd pressed in, a single, many-headed animal. And the first cry went up, "Rope, no!" Father O'Malley's voice was a cannon, cutting through the din. He stood on the top step of the town hall, a makeshift wooden platform. He was in his black cassock, his face grim, and in his hand he held the blackened, lemon juice-stained paper. "This is not a mob," he bellowed, his voice accustomed to reaching the back pew. "This is a town. This is a jury. And we will have order. We will have testimony. We will have justice, not murder." He turned, his gaze finding Elowen as Sutton guided her through the parting, murmuring crowd. O'Malley extended his hand. "Child," he said, "come, speak. Let them hear the truth you paid for." Elowen took his hand. She was trembling, but she ascended the steps, standing above the 3 men who had been shoved to their knees at the bottom. She held the real ledger in one hand, and the charcoal copy, the one with Pike's arrogant, waxy seal, in the other. Silence fell, absolute and heavy, broken only by the sound of the new, clean water rushing down the gutters. "He called it a dead water contract," Elowen began, her voice small at first, then gaining the iron she had found in the mountains. It was the accountant's voice, the voice of pure fact. "He meant it. A contract to sign our rights away, only after he had shut off the creek." She pointed to Pike. "He used his bench to condemn your land." She pointed to Torna. "He used railroad money to buy it for pennies. And he," she pointed to Cray, "used his badge to hunt me, to silence the truth." "It was a plan," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "To raise the water fees by 300%, to force you to sell your land, your homes, your children's future, all to the man who was strangling you." A sound, a wail of pure grief, came from the crowd. A woman, Mrs. Henshaw, shoved her way to the front. She was not holding a jug. She was holding a single, small, battered tin cup. She threw it. It clattered on the steps at Pike's feet. "My son! Judge!" she shrieked, her face a mask of tears and fury. "My boy is sick from the alkali well, the only well you left us. He has a fever from the salt. And you sit there in your fine robes." The crowd surged. The cry of rope came again, louder, a deep-chested roar. They were done with testimony. Hollis Cray saw it. He saw the faces. He saw the end. He was a cornered animal, and he did the only thing he knew. He lunged, not at the crowd, but at Elowen. She was his only shield, his only hostage. He grabbed for her, his hand a claw, a knife appearing from his boot. "Back off," he screamed. "All of you, back off, or she." He never finished. Sutton Rook moved. He had been standing on the edge of the platform, a silent, watchful shadow. He was not a shadow now. He was a force. He moved with a speed that was almost supernatural. A life of silent hunting and hard survival concentrated into one terrible purpose. In his hand, he held a length of rope. It was old, pale, and horribly stiff. It was the rope that had been used on him, the one he had cut from the beam, the one he had kept in his pack as a reminder. He did not hit Cray. He did not shoot. He let the rope do the work. As Cray's arm reached for Elowen, Sutton's arm flashed out. The rope, a perfect, practiced loop, sailed over Cray's head, but it did not settle on his neck. It fell, fast as a snake, tightening with a zip around his wrist, the one holding the knife. Sutton did not pull. He planted his feet, and he fell, using his entire body weight as an anchor. Cray was jerked forward as if hit by a train. His arm, snared by the rope, was nearly pulled from its socket. The knife clattered on the wood. He went down, face first, with a sickening, solid thud. Before the crowd could even gasp, Sutton was on him, his boot planted firmly in the center of Cray's back, his knee grinding into his neck. He was not killing him. He was pinning him. He was a piece of property. Delivered. A stunned, absolute silence. All eyes turned to Pike, the judge. His last line of defense gone, broke. He was no longer a man of law. He was just a terrified, sputtering man. He pointed a shaking finger at Torna. "It was him," Pike shrieked, his voice a high-pitched whine. "The railroad. He made me do it, the pressure, the money. It was all his idea." Torna, his face white with rage, scrambled back. "Liar, you came to me, you told me how to do it, and he—" Torney's finger stabbed at Cray. "He was your enforcer. He took your blood money. He said he would handle the girl." They were a pathetic, unraveling knot of their own greed. They collapsed, not from the crowd, but from the weight of the two ledgers that lay on the step above them. They were undone by their own sealed, authenticated, and now, public confession. "Enough," Father O'Malley commanded. He looked at the crowd. He found the two men he sought. Mr. Henshaw Ramon Tejada. The two men, the rancher and the stablemaster, came forward. "You are men of honor." O'Malley said, "You will be the witness for this town." He took the two ledgers from Elowen. He took the signed statement that he, Henshaw, and Ramon had prepared, attesting to what they had seen and heard. He took a stick of wax from his own pocket and, using a torch from the crowd, he lit it, dripping the dark blue wax onto the ribbon that bound the books and the statement together. He pressed the church's seal, a cross and a circle, firmly into it. "This is not for us," he declared, holding the sealed bundle high. "This is not for the rope. This is for the federal marshal. This is evidence. This is law." A man in the back yelled, "He does not deserve a marshal. He deserves the beam." The crowd murmured, the bloodlust still hot. Sutton Rook, his boots still crushing the air from Cray's lungs, looked up, his eyes, pale and cold, swept the crowd. He said nothing, but his gaze, the gaze of a man who had been there, who had felt the rope, was a more powerful statement than any speech. O'Malley saw it. "We are not them," he said, his voice soft but carrying. "We do not hang men in the dark. We do not use a rope to settle a score. That was the old way." He looked at Sutton, then at Elowen. "We have seen what that way does. No, you will take these three men. You will lock them in our jail, and they will wait, in the light, for a federal judge." He looked at the ranchers. "Justice is not a knot. It is a signature, and tonight we have it." There was a long, tense beat. The crowd looked at each other. They looked at the new water. A miracle. They looked at Elowin, their savior, and they looked at Sutton, their conscience. Henshaw was the first to move. He spat on the ground at Pike's feet. "Get up," he growled. He and 2 other ranchers grabbed Pike and Torn, hauling them to their feet. Ramon, his face grim, helped Sutton bind Cray's hands. The crowd did not cheer. They watched, in a new, solemn, cold silence, as the 3 most powerful men in Mesa Fortuna were dragged, not to the gallows, but to the jail. Justice was a locked door. The crowd began to break apart, their anger spent, replaced by a stunned, exhausted relief. They went to the wells, touching the water, talking in low, awed voices. Only Elowin and Sutton remained on the steps. The adrenaline, the fear, the long, terrible run. It all hit her at once. A shudder went through her, and her knees buckled. She was breathing in short, gasping sobs. Sutton, his work done, turned. He saw her sway. He was at her side in an instant. His hand, the one with the pale, wide scar, clamped onto her shoulder, steadying her. He did not ask. He simply supported her, his body a solid wall. She leaned into him, her forehead resting on his shoulder, her hands clutching his duster. He stood there, holding her, and looked down at the top of her head. His face, that hard, sun-scorched mask, was broken. In his pale eyes, there was a fierce, burning pride, and a relief so profound it looked like pain. He had been saved by a stranger in the desert, and now he had saved her. He had seen justice done, not with a rope, but with a book. She looked up. The thick black clouds of the storm, like the smoke from the fire, were finally pulling apart. Through a gap, like a promise, the first cold, clean stars appeared, shining down on the red-tiled roof of the quiet church. They did not return to Mesa Fortuna. They left the town to its new dawn, to the sounds of its own water, and the slow, grinding gears of federal justice that Father O'Malley and Ramon would set in motion. They rode Arrow, not hard, but with the steady, exhausted gait of horses pointed toward home. When they crested the last ridge and saw the small, hidden patch of green that was Rook's Hollow, Elowin let out a breath she felt she had been holding since she first saw the 2 ledgers. The water wheel was still turning. The sound of it, the steady, rhythmic splash and creak, was not the sound of isolation she had first heard. It was the sound of a heartbeat. It was a lullaby. Sutton led the horse to the lean-to, his movements slow, his body aching. But he was methodical, as always. He unsaddled Arrow, rubbed him down, and checked his hooves, his hands gentle on the animal that had saved them. Elowin, meanwhile, went inside the cabin. It was exactly as they had left it. The 4 tin cups still hung on the wall, but the room, which had seemed so spare and perfect, now felt impossible, small. She unpacked their few belongings from the saddlebags, the hardtack, the charcoal, and, at the bottom, the faded calico dress and kerchief that had been her disguise as a honey-seller's wife. She looked at the scrap of cloth. It was a symbol of their first true conspiracy. Their first She did not fold it. She took the faded yellow kerchief and walked to the porch, on a bare wooden peg by the door, where a man might hang his hat. She hung the scarf. It was a small, defiant patch of color against the gray wood. It was a sign, not a warning. It said a house was not just occupied, but inhabited. It said they were done running. For 2 days, they barely spoke. They slept, a deep, profound, and separate sleep. Sutton took his old cot. Elowin took the small guest bed, the one with the pine needle mattress. They were 2 survivors in a lifeboat, beached and needing time to remember the feel of solid ground. On the 3rd day, Elowin woke to a new sound. Scree, scara pe-his. It was the sound of a saw. She went outside, shading her eyes. Sutton was not by the water wheel. He was at the north side of the cabin, the side that was a blank log wall. He had already marked out a square in the dirt, laid foundation stones he had dragged from the creek bed. Now, He was sawing fresh, clean-smelling pine boards, his body moving in the same tireless, economical rhythm he used for everything. He was building. He did not acknowledge her. He was deep in his work, a man of how. He was processing the storm, the running, the kiss in the cave, the violence in the town hall, by turning it into sawdust and sweat. Elowen watched him. He was a man who had built a wall of solitude around himself. Now, he was physically, tangibly, knocking a hole in that wall. He was adding a room. She did not ask him why. She understood. She went inside, made a pot of coffee, and brought a cup to him. She set it on a stump, not interrupting his motion. He paused, saw the cup, and gave her a single, quick nod. It was their old language. She watched him frame the new wall, and she saw that he was framing a window. It was not a small, defensive slit, like the other windows in the cabin. It was a wide, generous square, and it did not face the path, or the ridge, or any line of approach. It faced east, overlooking the open, sunlit meadow he had once told her was called Juniper Vale. It was a window designed not for watching, but for seeing. He worked until the light began to fail. He hammered the last stud in place and stood back, wiping his face with his sleeve. He was a man made of hard angles and sawdust. He looked at the new raw yellow frame of the doorway. He was awkward, a man who had faced down a mob but was terrified of this new, quiet space. Elowen came to stand beside him, the scent of the fresh-cut pine enveloping them. "It is a good view," he said, his voice rusty. "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at the raw wood, at his scarred hands. He cleared his throat. "The roof. It will be on by tomorrow. If the weather holds." He was failing. He was a man of action, and the words were like foreign tools. He took a breath. He turned to her, and in the twilight, his pale eyes were dark and very deep. He looked at her as he had in the cave, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had tried to blow away. "Elowen," he said, and the name was a soft, hesitant thing. Will you stay?" The question hung in the cool, pine-scented air. It was a simple question, but it was the biggest how of his life. "How do I live? How do I stop being alone?" Elowen did not answer for a long moment. She looked at this man of scars and silence, the man who had been to the edge of death and come back carrying only the rope that put him there. She did not just say yes. She stepped forward, into the new, unfinished room, into the new life he was offering. She put her hand flat on his chest, over the steady, bedrock heart. "You saved me in the desert, Sutton," she said, her voice soft. "But that is not why I am staying." She felt his heart speed up, just a fraction, under her palm. "You trusted me, in the cabin, with the ledger. You never asked why. You did not ask if I was lying. You did not ask if I was right." She looked up, her gaze locking with his. "You believed me. You trusted me before I even trusted myself." Her hand moved from his chest, up to his face. She touched the sun-scorched leather of his cheek. "I was just a girl running, afraid of my own shadow. You made me, you made me brave." His own hand came up, covering hers, pressing her palm against his face. He shut his eyes, a shudder going through him. The wall was down. That night, the air was warm, thick with the scent of the cypress trees and the resin from the new lumber. They did not go to their separate beds. He took her hand, and they walked, down past the sound of the water wheel, to the small, quiet creek that fed it. He laid out a blanket. The moon was a silver sliver, and the stars were a brilliant, scattered map. He turned to her. He did not grab her. He did not rush. He stood before her, his hands at his sides, asking permission with his eyes. He was the man from the sheepfold, hesitant, courteous, offering a warmth he was not sure he deserved to give. She gave him the answer. She stepped into his space, her arms sliding around his waist, and she laid her head on his chest. "I am home, Sutton," she whispered. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of a man setting down a weight he had carried for a decade. His arms came around her, pulling her close, his face burying in her hair, which smelled of mint tea and sunlight. They were two survivors. They were learning to say we. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, sand-scoured kiss of the cave. It was slow. It was deep. It was a kiss of profound, healing quiet. His lips were not chapped now. They were soft, and they were sure. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and the future. When they pulled apart, it was only to breathe, to look at each other in the starlight. His rough, scarred hands, the hands that could build a wall or tie a bandage, were impossibly gentle. They moved, tracing her shoulders, her jawline, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. He was memorizing her. Her own hands were just as active. She held his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his wrist. Not in pity, but in reverence. It was the mark of the man who had survived. They kissed again, a longer, slower exploration. It was a language of its own. It was a quiet, controlled passion, a promise. His hands moved, guiding her, but they were respectful, stopping at her waist, her back, his embrace a fortress of security. Her heart was speaking, louder than her body, and it was saying safe, safe, safe. He held her, tight and sure, and she held him back, her anchor in a world that had been a storm. It was the touch of two souls who had seen the worst of men and had decided to build a life with the best of each other. Later, they lay on the blanket, tangled together, her head on his shoulder, his arm a heavy, warm bar across her. The air was cool, the blanket warm. Above them, the frogs in the creek bed began their nightly song, a deep, liquid chorus, backed by the steady, splashing lullaby of the water wheel. It was the sound of life, abundant and free. Elowen lay, listening, a small, sleepy smile on her face. She was completely at peace. Sutton, she whispered into the darkness. His voice was a low rumble. I am not afraid of the sound of hoofbeats anymore. She felt him grow still. He had known, then, the terror that sound had held for her. It had meant Cray, the posse, the chase, the end. He shifted, pulling her closer, his lips brushing the top of her head. That is good, he said, his voice thick, because from now on, they will only mean we are home. When the dawn came, it was not an enemy, it was not a deadline, it was a promise. A single, golden ribbon of light touched the peak of the ridge and spilled down into the hollow, painting the new, raw lumber of the addition with gold. They were already up. They were not in the blanket. They were dressed, and they were walking, leading Arrow out to the Juniper Vale meadow. The dew was a mist of diamonds on the new grass, and the air was clean and cold. In the far, far distance, from over the ridge, they heard the faint sound of the bell from the church in Mesa Fortuna. It was not an alarm. It was ringing for the morning market, the first market, in a very long time, where the water in the troughs was full, clean, and free. The federal courtroom in Sable Junction was silent, a high-ceilinged room that smelled of new plaster and Eastern law. It was a world away from the dusty, compromised square of Mesa Fortuna. Elowen and Sutton sat in the back row, not as defendants or accusers, but as witnesses who had already spoken their truth. The federal judge, a man with a gray beard and the eyes that had seen too much paper to be fooled by any of it, read his summary. His voice was flat, a tool of indisputable fact. Upon review of the evidence, he stated, his gaze sweeping over the sealed bundle that Father O'Malley had delivered. This court finds that Judge Bartholomew Pike and Mr. Silas Torn did conspire to defraud the citizenry of Mesa Fortuna, using their positions of trust to manipulate public resources for private gain. He did not look at Pike or Torna, who sat, pale and small, at the defense table. The assets of both men acquired through this conspiracy are hereby forfeit, to be placed in trust and used as restitution for the water cooperative of Mesa Fortuna. Further, Hollis Cray, found in gross dereliction of duty, abuse of power, and conspiracy, is permanently stripped of any office of the law. The judge looked up, his eyes finding Elowen in the back row. And finally, This court declares all contracts signed under duress regarding the Fortuna Creek Basin null and void. The water rights are, and will remain, the property of the people." A gavel struck the wood. It was a sound as final as a gunshot, but it was the sound of order, not of violence. It was over. As they filed out into the clean, wide street, they were approached by Henshaw, the rancher whose son had been sick. He was clean-shaven, his eyes clear for the first time. "Miss Vale," he said, holding his hat in his hands. "The new, well, we are calling it the Willow Flats Irrigation Cooperative. We voted. We would be honored if you would serve as our treasurer to keep the numbers clean." Elowen looked at the man, at the hope in his face. She looked at Sutton, who was standing by their horse, watching the sky, leaving the choice entirely to her. She smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Mr. Henshaw, but my home is at Rook's Hollow." She saw his face fall, and she quickly added, "But I will accept, on one condition. I will set up the books, I will write the rules, and I will train your new treasurer. Whoever you choose, I will teach them to listen to what the numbers are saying." Henshaw beamed. "We would be in your debt, ma'am. In your debt." They returned to a different Mesa Fortuna. The town was not just surviving, it was building. The new water, flowing freely down the Raven Cut, had turned the Willow Flats into a sea of green. The ranchers, with a new energy, had decided to make Sutton's desperate fix a permanent one. They gathered, contributing wood and stone, and they built a new, proper spillway. It was a solid, handsome thing of oak and river rock. They did not know what to call it, until Ramon Tejada, wiping sweat from his brow, looked at the clean, overflowing canal. "We call it the Ledger Spillway," he said, his voice quiet, "because it took a girl with a book to remind us what was ours." And so it was. A week later, Elowen and Sutton rode by, and they saw it. Someone, probably Henshaw, had taken a chisel and carved, small and deep, into the new foundation stone EV. Sutton, too, was building. The new room was finished, its wide window now glazed, the morning sun pouring into the cabin, but he had not stopped. He was expanding the lean-to, building a proper stable, large enough for 4 horses. He was making room. He was planning for a future that was larger than himself. One afternoon, Elowen found him in the new, high-raftered space. He was holding the rope, the pale, stiff, old rope that had taken his first life, the rope that had caught Cray. She watched, her heart in her throat, wondering if he would burn it, bury it. He did neither. He swung it, once, his arm a strong, steady pendulum, and tossed it over the highest, darkest beam in the new stable. It hung there, a silent, pale snake, a reminder. "It is to remember," he said to her, though she had not asked, "that justice can wait, that it does not always come with a badge, but it does not forget." He was no longer the man who had been hunted by it. He was the man who would ensure it was never needed again. Summer came, high and hot, and Mesa Fortuna, for the first time in memory, had water to spare. The town declared a first water festival. It was an excuse for a market day, but mostly, it was a day of profound, collective relief. The steam pump was working again, but it was drawing from a full creek. The troughs in the square were overflowing, and someone had built a makeshift sprinkler, a pierced tin pipe, in the center of the square. Children, who a few months ago were sipping salty, rationed water, now ran screaming with joy through the spray, their laughter as loud and bright as a summer shower. Sutton and Elowen were there. They walked on the edge of the crowd, 2 quiet people in a loud, happy world. He had bought her a lemonade. She had bought him a new, polished wood pipe, which he held, unlit, in his hand, touched by the gesture. He held her hand. It was a simple, public act that felt more intimate than any kiss. He stopped walking, by a stall selling brightly colored ribbons. He looked at her, his face serious, his pale eyes full of the bright, noisy day. "Elowen," he said. He reached into his pocket, He did not pull out a box. He pulled out a small, simple, hammered silver band. He had made it himself from $2 silver, hammered and polished until it shone with a soft, clean light. He did not kneel. He just stood there, this man of rock and water, holding out a piece of his own heart, and his voice was as quiet and as deep as the creek in his hollow. Stay. It was not a question of the day or the week. It was a question of forever. Elowen's eyes filled. The sound of the children's laughter, the smell of wet dust and roasted corn, the feel of his calloused hand. It all rushed in. She did not need to speak. She just nodded. A single, profound movement. He did not slide the ring onto her finger. He just watched her, his own eyes bright. So she took it from his palm, and with a hand that shook, she put it on her own finger. It was a perfect fit, and in the middle of the bright, loud, crowded square, surrounded by the town they had saved, they kissed. It was not the desperate kiss of the cave, or the quiet promise of the hollow. It was a simple, public, daytime kiss. It was as bright and as clean and as necessary as the sunlight catching the new water. They rode home as the sun was setting, taking the long way over Moonfield Hill. The day cooled, the sky turning a deep, velvet purple. As they reached the crest, the world below them lit up, a cloud of fireflies. Thousands of them rose from the damp. Happy fields. They swirled around the horses, a silent, magical galaxy of tiny, moving lights. Elowen laughed, a sound of pure delight. She watched them, these tiny, moving sparks. They look like numbers, she whispered, her head on his shoulder as they rode. Sutton nodded, his arm tight around her waist. She smiled. They were not the dark, coded, hidden numbers of the ledger, the numbers that stole and lied. These were numbers of light. They were transparent and bright and dancing in the open for the entire world to see. That night, they sat on the porch of the finished cabin. The new room was behind them, the juniper veil sleeping in the moonlight. The sound of the water wheel, their heartbeat, was the only sound. Elowen had a book on her lap. It was a new ledger, bound in clean, fresh leather, the one she would use to start the town's new life. She opened it to the first, clean, white page. She uncorked a bottle of fresh, black ink. She dipped the pen. Sutton watched as she wrote, her hand steady. It was not a column of figures. It was a dedication. Water for all, love for two, and the past for the wind to take. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us an extra boost by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.